Okay, so another big one, back to some of these frameworks. So we talked about the rapture. Well, then what is the tribulation? That was another question we got. Well, like, what is this then? And do we have to be worried about 7 years of horrendous evil that's about to hit at any moment, which is the typical, way of saying it? Again, some people saying, the rapture will be before that, so we don't have to worry about it. But I also have friends that say, oh no, the rapture will be after the tribulation, so buckle up. We're going to have this horrid period that Revelation lays out, all these terrible things that will happen.
Yeah.
What's the tribulation?
Yeah. And this goes back to, this is complicated, because this goes back to Revelation, but also Matthew 24. And I think the rest of the New Testament. But Matthew 24, there's different readings of it. There's preterist readings, which see like pretty much all of it as referring to AD 70. I don't go there.
You're saying that this section in Matthew, this is the prophecy that Jesus is giving about all these things that are going to happen, and some people saying, this happened within the lifetime of the apostles, like the destruction of the temple and, and so forth.
So I'll try to be really quick here. But what prompts this is the disciples ask, what will be the signs of your coming of the end of the age? And Jesus says, there's going to be wars, rumors of wars. False messiahs are going to come and lead many astray, which is interesting, right? Many will come in my name saying, I am the Messiah. Like, who are those? They're they're non-Messiah people, right? And they lead people astray. There'll be wars, but don't be alarmed. The end is not yet. Nation will rise up against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Will be famines, earthquakes, etc. These are just the beginning of the birth pains, right? This is tribulation language. But he's saying this is just the beginning. They'll deliver you up to tribulation. You'll be put to death. You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. The one who endures to the end will be saved. And then, so this seems to be something of an overview of the type of tribulation that Jesus' own disciples are going to experience, but also what's going to happen. This is from the beginning of the birth pains to the last push, if we want to say, right? Okay. And then he zeroes in on the what he speaks of as the abomination of desolation, which is drawing on Daniel's vision, which kind of some of that probably had at least one initial fulfillment in Antiochus Epiphanes, that nasty king who desecrated the temple and turned it into it banned Judaism and stuff in the 2nd century BC. But that itself is sort of a prefiguration of the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Those come after Jesus. And so Jesus speaks of the immediate destruction of Jerusalem that's coming. And he says, flee, etc. But then he seems to sort of be merging that. He seems to be treating that almost as the beginning of the big tribulation, right? When you see the abomination of desolation, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, get out, right? And then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now and never will be. And if those days hadn't been shortened, no human being will be saved. And then all sorts of false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, the elect. All of this stuff, which doesn't seem to be just AD 70, but it seems to start there, right? It's just, right? And then he says, if people say, look, Jesus is back in the wilderness, don't go there because you'll know when he's back, right? And then he says, after the tribulation of those days, and those days seems to be this whole era from like the beginning of birth pangs to all the way to, right before the return. And then he says, the moon will be darkened, the stars will fall from heaven, and then will appear the Son of Man coming in the clouds. And it seems that what my take is that what he's doing here, and if you want to read others on this, Craig Keener in his Matthew commentary, Osborne as well in his commentary on Matthew, there's plenty of good takes, but is that what's happening is Jesus is taking the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem that's going to happen 40 years after Jesus is saying these things, is in a sense the beginning of this era of judgment that will culminate in this era of tribulation that will culminate in the final judgment. So in New Testament studies, we talk about inaugurated eschatology, the already not yet, the idea that the era of salvation is both here, but not fully here. So like Jesus rose from the dead, but the rest of us haven't risen from the dead yet. Or like we've have the Spirit, but the Spirit is the first fruits of the full inheritance, right? So we have it, but not yet. And I think that the flip side of that inaugurated eschatology is judgment, the judgment side. That the destruction of Jerusalem, just like Jesus' resurrection from the dead was the first installment, the first part of new creation, the destruction of the temple was sort of symbolically the first part of this judgment that will culminate in final judgment, final destruction. And that's why it makes so much sense for Jesus to use it why we start, it sounds like he's mixing up the judgments, the tribulations that he seems to think all of his followers will, from his immediate disciples, and it seems to drag on for a while, because he says, I don't know when I'm coming back, and there'll be all sorts of false people arising and, all that kind of thing. But in a sense, the destruction of Jerusalem kind of seems to mark symbolically the beginning of the end in that way, just like Jesus' resurrection marks the beginning of the beginning, right?
I've never thought of that before. That's really interesting. So you're not saying, oh, the tribulation is going to be this chunk of time when this is going to happen. You're not, I don't know what the word is, boxing it in quite like that. Again, classical style of reading this stuff is like, oh, it's this block, this specific thing. Yeah. It's all broke down. They have all these formulas, whatever, all this stuff figured out exactly how, boom. That's not what we're going for, though.
I think that Jesus here is speaking of this whole era, right? That the whole time as the disciples wait for Jesus' return, we see like there are signs that the end is upon us in all the tribulation in the world, but we still we can't use any of those signs to know the moment Jesus is going to come back, right? I mean, he says that.
See, I think that's the one point there, because you mentioned this in the other episode, where it's basically the style of you like read Revelation and then read the headlines and then try to put the two together. Right. It's like that's not what we're going for here.
Right. Because the point is not to figure out when exactly the end is, because he says concerning the day or the hour no one knows, but the point is, as he says, to stay awake and be ready, right? And so all the tribulation is supposed to be a reminder, we're living in this era of judgment, and that era could end, that God could cut short those days at any moment, right? And I think that fits very much with the rest, what the New Testament says, what the rest of the New Testament says about tribulation. So John 16, in the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Peter sees in 1 Peter, it's all about expecting his readers to be living through an era of suffering that's followed by glory. 1 Thessalonians 1, it is evidence of the righteous judgment of God that you may be considered worthy of the kingdom of God for which you are suffering, since God considers it just to repay with affliction those who afflict you, and to grant relief to you who are afflicted as well as to us when the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. The whole New Testament is all about is expecting that we live in a time marked by tribulation, and in a sense of the beginnings of God, the birth pains of God's judgment. Revelation uses the word tribulation throughout, in many cases, to speak of what Christians throughout the ages are going through, right? I know your tribulation and your poverty, he says in one of the letters in Revelation 7, speaking of, I think, all of the martyrs or God's people throughout the ages. These are the ones who are coming out of great tribulation. Then the question is, well, but what about those 3.5 year numbers, right? Right. Yeah. And what's going on there, so John uses this in chapter 11 and 12 of Revelation, and maybe 13. These numbers come up 4 times. Sometimes it says 1,260 days, sometimes it's time and half time, and one time it's that time, and another time it's 42 months. The 2 other times it's 42 months, something like that. And but it refers to the same period of time. And what he's doing there is symbolically, it's kind of, to me, fairly clear because of the way he uses it in chapter 12 to speak of the entire time when this woman is being kept by God in the wilderness, but also chased down by the dragon, right? Or the whole time that those 2 witnesses representing the church are bearing witness and being opposed in chapter 11. He's drawing that from one of Daniel's visions, where the vision of the weeks, where Daniel sees this figure that will sort of cause great disturbance to God's people in the half of this prophetic week of years or whatever, right? Yeah. Okay. And or from Daniel 7:25, this specifically mentions that, and I think this is particularly relevant. Yeah. As for the 10 horns, so this is the beast, the fourth beast, which is kind of the pattern that John uses for his beasts in Revelation. He has 10 horns. Out of this kingdom, 10 kings shall arise. Another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones. He shall speak words against the Most High. He will wear out the saints of the Most High and shall think to change the time and the laws. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But, so that's the 3.5 symbolic years. Okay. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion will be taken away and given to the people of the saints of the Most High. And I think what John is doing is he's taking that 3.5 years, kind of like fourscore and however many years ago, at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, right? Oh, it's this symbolic number. I mean, Lincoln obviously was referring to a specific number of years, but the way we say it, like fourscore and something, if I say it that way, I'm evoking the whole history of the Civil War and blah, blah, blah. I think John's doing something similar. That 3.5 years in Daniel represents this time. I think a symbolic time is half of 7. It's a limited time, but it's a time of suffering and tribulation where the beast rules, is given some dominion, but it will end when the kingdom is fully in the hands of the saints, right? And so John takes that 3.5 years and plops it into cases where it seems to me fairly clear that he's talking about this whole era, right? So the woman she gives the birth to the male child. The woman, this is like a super cool story, but we can't talk about it. But she gives birth, and then she flees into the wilderness where she has a place prepared by God for 1,260 days. Then Michael and his angels fight against the dragon, and they come down, and then they try to persecute the woman, and then the dragon becomes furious with the woman, goes off to make war on the rest of her offspring, and we have the 1,260 again. It seems like this whole time of where the dragon's furious is this 1,260 or times and a half a time, it says here, period. Okay. So that language of 3.5 years of tribulation, I think it's drawing off of Daniel because that's a number that represents this finite period of time where that's marked by oppression and tribulation. And John seems to be employing that symbolically to refer to this whole age, the same age Jesus is talking about in Matthew, where he speaks of this whole era of time while from the destruction of Jerusalem, so to speak, to Jesus' return, that's marked by tribulation, but Jesus promised to keep us, to keep his people, until his return.
So really, some people say this is symbolic of a 7 years of tribulation, blah, blah, blah. You're saying, no, this is symbolic of something else, essentially.
Yeah, I think it's symbolic of the whole era this whole era is marked both by salvation for us and also by tribulation for us and for the world. Yeah. I think that's how I understand it.
That's really interesting because you can go down some interesting streets if you're like, well, there's a set time in the future where tribulation is coming and all this. You can start, I don't know. You can get down some interesting paths with that really, really quickly. Right. And I don't know. I'm often kind of wondered about that. You can go down to fear-mongering really quickly as well. And maybe not, you know. But, okay, so that's really interesting. So,
and again, this then corresponds pretty well with what we read in the whole rest of the New Testament, right? This expectation of God's judgment that comes throughout these last days, if we want to call them, this whole era, the expectation that believers suffer, it's what we read the whole rest of the New Testament. So, and it's what many Christians throughout history have experienced.
Wow, that is a really good point.
It's easier for us to say, well, maybe there's going to be 7 bad years in the future. But for believers and persecuted believers in the Middle East or Asia or whatever, that makes less sense, right? It makes a lot more sense to say, this is a time marked by tribulation.
That does, and it also takes Revelation, instead of being something out there somewhere, it brings it down to us,
which is
and makes it immediately relevant to us again.
John tells the people.